In the early 90s, Marvel and DC dominated the comic market in America, and manga was just this niche product. But just over 10 years later, more than half of all comics sold in America were manga, and that trend has basically continued to today. I feel like we never stop to talk about how unique this is. Historically, America is not a big importer of pop culture, yet roughly half of the comics we read come from a single small country on the other side of the globe. So I wanted to know, how did that happen? So I looked for an explanation, but I wasn't satisfied with what I found. So to find out, I ended up talking to many of the most influential people in the American manga industry in what turned out to be over 11 hours of interviews. And what I found was a fascinating story of rivalries, jealousy, big mistakes, and a lot of people really passionate about Japanese comics. This is a long one, but I hope you'll join me to explore the history of how manga conquered America. This story actually begins way back in 1970 at the West Coast Science Fiction and Fantasy Convention with a man named Fred Patton, a librarian and an avid member of comics and science fiction fandom. As he browses the conference, he comes to the booth for the Man from U.N.C.L.E. TV series, where the exhibitors had collected Man from U.N.C.L.E. merch from around the world. And there, on the table, Patton found a Man from U.N.C.L.E. comic from Japan. While Patton couldn't read Japanese, he was blown away by the art, and he had every right to be, because the author was none other than Takao Saito, one of Japan's greatest manga artists. The exhibitor told Patton that they had picked the book up at a Japanese bookstore in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo district. So, after the conference, Patton went to the bookstore and was blown away to discover a massive section of Japanese comics. Even though he couldn't read the language, he realized he was seeing something special, and soon he was amassing a massive collection of untranslated manga that he would try to read just based on the pictures alone. And soon he discovered a favorite author among the manga he had collected, Osamu Tezuka. Patton may not have known it, but Tezuka was the most important figure in the creation of modern manga and anime. Sort of like if Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, Walt Disney, and Charles Schulz were all rolled into one. He's even known in Japan as the god of manga. Patton wanted to share this newfound love, so with a friend, he began a small business out of his home, importing and reselling this untranslated manga. He would write manga fanzines and offer the books to readers by mail order. Slowly, very slowly, Patton began building a grassroots manga fandom here in the US.
There are dozens of us! Dozens!
Soon, Patton's activities expanded to buying expensive copies of Japanese cartoons and screening them for fans at science fiction conventions and clubs. These early group screenings evolved into the Cartoon Fantasy Organization in the late 70s. And then there was a fateful misunderstanding. In 1977, Osamu Tezuka himself was coming to the United States. His managers had sought to bring significant business people in the US to meet with Tezuka, and somehow Fred Patton got invited. So Patton found himself greatly out of place among all these Japanese businessmen at a swanky Japanese restaurant in LA's Little Tokyo district. It turned out that because Patton had been buying so many of Tezuka's books, Tezuka's managers mistakenly assumed that he was a big Japanese bookseller or publisher, not a fan operating out of his house. But Patton wouldn't miss his opportunity, and through Tezuka's translator, geeked out and asked him a bunch of questions about his manga. Now, rather than being annoyed, Tezuka was intrigued to find an American who was so familiar with his work, when many of the businessmen he was supposed to be there meeting with were not. Patton told Tezuka about the Cartoon Fantasy League, and Tezuka decided that he would visit them on his next trip to the US to see if it could possibly be true that a group of Americans were reading manga and watching anime. And so it was that the next year, in 1978, Tezuka attended a meeting of the club. It was true, he realized, these Americans were interested in manga. Tezuka was an endlessly curious person, and the wheels began turning. Pieces he'd been putting together for some time were finally falling into place. See, at this small meeting, there was another person who would end up being one of the most important figures in bringing manga to America. Not Tezuka himself, but this guy over here, Tezuka's interpreter, Frederick Schott. How did this Westerner end up being one of the key people in Tezuka's entourage? Well, I was able to interview him and find out.
A lot of people say, how do you become a Japanese translator, a manga translator? You know, I want to become a manga translator. For me, it's always been a labor of love.
Frederick Schott never intended to be one of the people bringing manga to America. In fact, even though he'd lived in Japan a few years as a kid, he'd never even read manga. It wasn't until he came back to Japan for college that he was exposed to the medium. At the time, in the late 60s, manga was in the midst of an upheaval. Like Marvel Comics in the US around the same time, manga targeting young boys had become cool for college students to read. And so Schott began casually reading manga as a way to decompress from his exhaustive studies. Soon, a friend noticed that Schott had been reading manga and came to his dorm room with a special delivery.
And he came to me one day and he said, Fred, you know, if you're really into manga, you got to read this. It was almost like giving me a Bible or, the Koran or something like that.
This book wasn't the Bible, it was Phoenix by Osamu Tezuka. Here was a work of great ambition. It was Tezuka doing something mature, serious, thought-provoking, something that could be filed along with great literature. It opened Schott's eyes to the powerful possibilities possibilities of this medium and filled him with the desire to share it with the world. As he bounced back and forth between Japan and the US over the next few years, his desire to share manga with the Western world never left him, nor did his love of Phoenix. So, along with a few friends, he began to translate Tezuka's epic work. Through a friend, Schott and his group got in touch with Tezuka's production company and were invited to their headquarters to show them the translation they'd been working on. They went in and sat down with one of Tezuka's business managers and began explaining their plan to translate Phoenix and bring it to America in hopes of finding a publisher. I can only imagine what Tezuka's manager thought about the 4 young hippies who thought they could publish manga in the US. But then, something happened.
While we were there discussing with Matsutani, I remember that Tezuka actually appeared in this little sort of reception space in his company, and then he gave us permission to translate the Phoenix.
Tezuka took a special interest in Schott and his fellow translator Jared Cook, these foreigners who loved manga and spoke fluent Japanese. He soon hired them as his English interpreters, and they would be present at many of Tezuka's meetings from then on, including on his trips to the US.
He had a big influence on my life, must say. Huge.
And so it was that Schott ended up at that pivotal meeting with the Cartoon Fantasy Club in 1978.
I'd never met people like that before, and to tell you the truth, they were almost scary.
So, as Schott and his friends were translating Phoenix, Tezuka had now seen firsthand the interest in the US in manga, and he began on a grand project. He would bring Japan's greatest manga artists to San Diego Comic-Con in 1980 to bridge the two cultures. And so, with the help of Fred Patton and the interpreting of Fred Schott and Jared Cook, Tezuka and 30 Japanese cartoonists set off to San Diego. Schott was prepared too. He and his group had not only translated all 5 volumes of Phoenix, they had flipped everything, relettered everything, and produced a copy ready for Western consumption. All they needed now was a publisher. The manga artists prowled the convention grounds, meeting with publishers. Schott showed people copies of the translated Phoenix. The manga boom was ready and prepared to happen, except it didn't. I've actually touched on this convention in previous videos because this is where both Wendy Pini and Carl Barks got to meet Tezuka. But the American comic industry as a whole really didn't care. After all those months working on the Phoenix, not a single publisher was interested. Upon going back to Japan, Schott's work went into the Tezuka archives to gather dust, and Tezuka turned his focus back to other projects. The idea of bringing manga to the US was dead. And maybe this story could have ended here, and manga never would have come to the US. But Fred Schott wasn't going to be satisfied with that.
People didn't know anything about manga in the United States. Most publishers had never heard of it. So that's how I came to this belief that I should write a book about manga first.
Schott's book would be a Trojan horse, a way to get American publishers more open to the idea of publishing manga in the US. And it turned out even writing this book wasn't going to be easy. Schott found a publisher in Japan willing to fund his research, but there was an issue.
A lot of people didn't think of manga as highbrow culture, and there was, I think, a little reluctance to, outside of the manga community, people thought, well, do we really want foreigners to know about this stuff? That kind of thing.
Manga didn't match the image that Japan wanted to project to the world in the 80s, nor did it match up with the US perception of the Japanese. Japan was supposed to be this polite society of tea ceremonies, samurai code, and fine craftsmanship. Not this. But Schott wanted to show the world that the nation of Japan was reading comics that were truly diverse. He would have to fight the Japanese publishing establishment. But he had a secret weapon.
I knew Tezuka. And at that point in history, knowing Tezuka was like the keys to the kingdom.
And so, with the support of Tezuka and a single brave editor at Kodansha, Schott began on his project, interviewing all of the top manga artists in Japan. Schott's book is going to be a major turning point for manga in the US, but before we get there, we need to take a brief detour. Because while Schott worked, someone actually did publish the first commercial manga in the US, and it might not be exactly who you're expecting. The driving force behind the first major manga to be published in America was, in fact, the anti-nuclear movement. After the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, groups in both Japan and abroad were committed to speaking out against nuclear weapons. And so, a volunteer group called Project Gen began translating Keiji Nakazawa's Barefoot Gen, a semi-autobiographical account of his time in Hiroshima and living through the bombing. Some of the translation was assisted by none other than Fred Schott himself. Can't escape this guy. The War Resisters League published the first 4 volumes in America beginning in 1978, before it was restarted in a comic book form by Comics. Neither comic sold particularly well, but it was a major milestone in getting manga onto American shelves. And, in fact, one important American cartoonist would read this edition of Barefoot Gen and be inspired to tell his own story of the horrors of World War II, but I'll get to that in a minute. Finally, by 1983, Schott is finished writing his book, but he has one last significant argument with his editor. Schott doesn't want to use the word manga in the title. He's afraid it's too foreign, that people will think it's an Italian cookbook. But thankfully, his editor wins the argument, and the book Manga Manga is born. If his editor hadn't went out, who knows what we'd be calling this stuff today. By the way, Manga Manga is not only important to this story, it's still one of the best pieces of writing on manga ever, so I'll put a link down below if you want to pick up a copy. It's great. While not a bestseller, it reached the right people, and even the mainstream news media began to cover it. Suddenly Americans, either through the book itself or all the news coverage around it, were exposed to the idea of manga. This idea that comics were a big deal in Japan, that they're not just made for children, but being read by women and businessmen, was a seed that was planted in the US consciousness and would grow over the next few years. But after years of disappointment, Schatz still wasn't optimistic about the fate of manga in the US.
The very first 1983 edition, I think I ended it saying, well, manga are probably never going to take off in the United States or something like that.
Of course, he couldn't have been more wrong, so let's look at how that seed began to grow. Remember that American cartoonist inspired by Barefoot Gen I mentioned a minute ago? His name was Art Spiegelman, and his Barefoot Gen inspired comic was a little book you might have heard of called Mouse. But before Mouse became the breakout hit of American graphic novels, Spiegelman and his wife, Françoise Mouly, were publishing Raw magazine, an avant-garde underground comic magazine which is still pretty much the hippest thing to have ever happened in comics. They ran an issue called Tokyo Raw, dedicated to the boundary-pushing works of experimental manga artists like Yoshiharu Suge. So 80s comic book hipsters got a first-hand look at manga, but it wasn't quite a commercial venture yet. But things were about to change rapidly. Shortly after the publication of Schatz's book, one of his hippie friends dropped by his apartment to see him. This friend's name was Seiji Horibuchi.
I'd heard stories about Seiji. He's a wonderful, interesting person. I think he'd been selling juice or something in Berkeley, and then he'd lived in a yurt in the mountains, north of San Francisco.
But now Horibuchi had a new idea, and he wanted Fred's advice. He wanted to bring Japanese manga to America, and he had started a new company to do so. The name of that company? Viz Comics. So let's meet Seiji Horibuchi, because he's not exactly the person you might suspect would found a multimedia empire. In 1969, a young Horibuchi had seen the Woodstock documentary and had become enamored with American music. During college, he and his bandmate/best friend Satoru Fuji traveled to San Francisco to immerse themselves in the music scene and fell in love with the Bay Area.
So I decided to, after I graduate the university, I decided to go to Bay Area. I didn't even attend the graduation ceremony. I just fly to San Francisco. That changed my life.
At first, Fuji and Horibuchi focused on their music, supporting themselves by playing guitar on the streets of Berkeley. But soon, Horibuchi became more intrigued by the exciting hippie and new age movement that was then blossoming in Berkeley and San Francisco.
I don't know, some people may be interested in the business, like Silicon Valley, but I was not interested in business at all at that time. And somebody said, let's go to a mountain together. So, okay, why not? Living in nature like that without no electricity, gas, water, nothing. I thought it might be fun to do that. I thought that was the most cool thing.
But after 2 years of living off the grid, something happened. Horibuchi had a friend, another Japanese immigrant who idolized him and had followed him to come live in the mountains. But one night, while Horibuchi was on a trip home to Japan, his friend got drunk and wandered off from the camp and disappeared. The group wouldn't find his body until the spring thaw. Horibuchi himself had to lead the boy's parents to help them recover his remains. This experience woke Horibuchi from his dream of living outside of society. He returned to Japan, and on this trip, two seemingly unrelated things happened. The first was a discovery of a manga that would change his life.
My friend introduced me, there's this cool manga that is Otomo's Dome. And I was shocked. Wow, the manga really developed. Even though I didn't think about I want to do some manga business or publishing manga at that time. I had no idea. I was just shocked.
The second was that he could build a business connecting these two cultures that he loved so much. So he returned to San Francisco and began importing and exporting small goods between the two countries. But while he built this small one-man business of selling Japanese imports, he had a fateful encounter. In Japan, his sister-in-law worked for Shogakukan, one of Japan's largest publishers of manga and magazines. When Mr. Oga, a member of the family that owned Shogakukan, was visiting San Francisco, she suggested that her brother-in-law Seiji could show him around. And so, the new age hippie took the wealthy heir to a publishing empire on a tour of San Francisco. And while they explored, they had an important conversation.
We started talking about there's no manga in Japan, in USA, there's a little bit of here and there, but not real publishing.
Oga was intrigued by this idea of publishing manga in the US, and when he returned to Japan, he got approval to invest some money in this new business, and he knew just who to hire to run it.
Then he trusted me somehow. This is my real first business. I had no idea what is a publishing company. and how to print, what is a print, how they print the books and things. I have no idea. And he gave me like probably $250,000 to start.
And so here was a hippie with $250,000 to build a manga business in the US. Well, he knew who to call.
When I first decided to do business, first person I visited was Fred. He was very nice. He's still my friend.
And I remember he came over to my place and he had this idea of porting Japanese manga. And I don't remember, but I probably told him, hey, good luck.
There is no way. I mean, of course, if I do it as a hobby, I can do that. But making it business is ridiculous.
Undeterred, Horibuchi recruited his best friend Fuji and his brother Shinji, and with the three of them, Viz Comics was born. Three San Francisco hippies had come to the US from Japan and were ready to bring manga to America. The question was, how? Of course, the first thing Viz needed was to hire people to begin translating manga. To assist in this, Fred Schott introduced Horibuchi to another key figure in this whole drama, Toren Smith. To hippies like Horibuchi and Schott, Toren Smith was an entirely different beast.
He believed in nuclear power and kind of person you don't find so much anymore. Very conservative, but also super liberal. He was a very smart guy. I don't know what Toren's IQ is, but I'm sure it was vastly higher than mine.
He would talk about lawsuits that he had won. He would talk about guns.
That's Alvin Liu, who was a journalist at San Francisco's alternative weekly paper and interviewed many of these people for an article at the time. More on him in a minute, but let's get back to Toren Smith. See, Smith had spent his early years working as a roughneck in Canada's oil fields, dreaming of writing science fiction novels. But in 1982, he discovered anime, and soon after that manga, and relocated to the Bay Area to learn Japanese and find a way to turn that love into a career. He quickly became one of the most prominent voices in the nascent anime and manga fandom. With a few friends, he basically put out the 1985 equivalent of Scanlations, little translation booklets that he sold at conventions that you could read alongside a Japanese copy of the manga. Soon, his 1986 Bacon Anime Guide became something like a Bible for early anime fans. Smith had become a leading voice in fandom, but still couldn't turn that love into a paying career. He had worked with Eclipse Comics, an independent US comic publisher, to try and get the rights to Lone Wolf and Cub and Akira, but they hadn't been able to convince the Japanese publishers to give them the licenses. And so, when Viz was getting ready to launch, he was a natural person to get involved. After Schott introduced them, Smith began working with Viz part-time, translating as well as helping them choose titles and advising them on strategy. Because in Japan, manga were serialized in weekly or monthly anthology magazines and then compiled into books that were sold in bookstores. But this was 1986. The idea that even American graphic novels would be sold in bookstores was still a few years away. And comics had even disappeared from newsstands, as Marvel and DC turned their attention to distributing exclusively in dedicated comic specialty shops, which became known as the direct market. To get their manga into readers' hands, Viz would need to find a way to get into this direct market. So Toren Smith introduced Viz to his friends at Eclipse, and they struck up a partnership. Eclipse would handle the production and distribution, while Viz handled the licensing and translation. But publishing into the American direct market would mean a lot of compromises. Manga that were originally published in weekly 20-page increments in anthology magazines would get turned into 32-page standalone monthly comic books. They were also flipped to read left to right, as no one believed Americans would be able to read a comic right to left. While they worked on these initial titles, Smith sold all of his possessions and moved to Japan to further dedicate himself to the manga business. But as things progressed, tensions grew. Not only was Smith at odds with the counterculture vibe of Viz, they couldn't see eye to eye on which titles they should publish. Smith was suggesting things like Appleseed and Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, but those were books not published by Viz's parent company Shogakukan. In passing, Horibuchi apparently told Smith he should just go and license and publish them himself. Horibuchi probably meant this as a polite deflection, never expecting that Smith could actually pull it off. But while in Japan, Smith had written a scathing critique of the westernized version of the Nausicaa anime, and that scathing critique won him an important fan, Nausicaa's creator, Hayao Miyazaki. Smith met with Miyazaki and actually got his permission to publish the Nausicaa manga in English. But that didn't sit well with Viz.
And Toren Smith, he thought he could publish Nausicaa, but actually we got rights. I met with Miyazaki, so I got rights directly talking with him. Maybe Toren Smith wasn't happy. I know he thought maybe I took the Nausicaa from him like that. He made so bad. But
this dispute over Nausicaa was the final nail in the coffin of the relationship between Viz and Toren Smith.
I don't know how the falling out with Seiji occurred, but it had something to do with Nausicaa and who was going to get to translate it. So that was something that Toren never forgot.
Now in Japan and out of work, Smith's situation was grim. The Japanese economy had collapsed and his finances were dwindling. He tried to make ends meet by working under the table as a janitor, but was soon reduced to stealing noodles from a local convenience store to be able to eat. That's hardly the last we'll hear of Smith, but for now, let's shift our attention back to the US. Before we get to that though, a quick word from today's sponsor, FlexiSpot. If you're like me, you spend a lot of time sitting. I sit at this desk for 8 or more hours every day. And ironically, even though I've tried to set things up ergonomically and lift up my monitor, I'm still using the same cheapo office chair I've had for years. I kind of think this thing has been destroying my body. I can't get it close enough to my desk, I can't lean back, this armrest is just broken, and yet I spend like half of my waking hours sitting on it. Thankfully, those days are over, because FlexiSpot just sent me their new C7 Max, and oh my god, chair technology has come a long way. First of all, there's tons of adjustability, so I can actually make it fit my body. I realized after I shot this that I had it all perfectly set up and then messed it up to show you guys how it works, so I hope you appreciate it. The lumbar support down here has been a game changer for me. I was trying to lower my old chair back down far enough so it would support my lower back, but then I would have no support for my upper back. Also, look at my old seat cushion. It was so squishy, which is not at all what you want for a long day of sitting. The C7 Max has this nice memory foam that actually supports my body for a long day of work. And my favorite part is these armrests. I find all sorts of weird positions that give me the support for whatever task I'm working on, and then when I'm bored, they're just a lot of fun to play with. And FlexiSpot offers a 30-day return policy, so you can try it out free and see what I'm talking about. And they offer a 10-year warranty with direct replacement of damaged parts. Seriously, ditch your cheap office chair and get a FlexiSpot chair. There's a link in the description, and you can use the code C730 to get $30 off your purchase. And if you're tight on money, you can check out the C5 chair, which has the same build quality, just with more basic adjustments. Alright guys, back to the video. Viz and Eclipse selected 3 titles to launch with. They did the legwork, reformatting them, bending and breaking them to fit in the American comic format, and finally launched them into comic shops in May of 1987. And in fact, they weren't the only manga launched in that month. At the same time, a comic company called Viz Comics brought out the manga Lone Wolf and Cub, also in comic book form. In fact, Lone Wolf and Cub might have been the most well-known manga in American comic shops at this point, because comic superstar Frank Miller had been raving about it in a bunch of interviews. Miller had in fact been the catalyst for the American version, doing new covers and writing introductions for the early issues. And so it was that in a single month in 1987, 4 new manga comic books were hitting American comic shops. How would they be received?
All 3 broken comics was sold out very quickly. So I thought, oh, I got it, you know?
Right out the gate, manga was a hit. Horibuchi was celebrating, and it was time to turn up the dial. Viz quickly began to expand their line of titles and print more copies month over month. The American public loved manga, and manga was going mainstream in 1987. Except, no, it wasn't, not at all. Viz had unknowingly entered into the comic market during what is called the black and white boom. See, a few years earlier, a little black and white indie comic called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had made a huge splash, and the people who had bought the early issues were making tons of money reselling them. So for the next few years, there was a significant group of collectors buying any black and white comic that came out, not to read them, but merely in the hope of someday flipping them and getting rich.
The black and white bust was a function of the irrational exuberance that this market often undergoes, where people go, oh, comics are worth money, they're worth money, we can sell things.
But like all good speculator bubbles, the collectors soon realized that their comics weren't going to make them rich, they stopped buying, and the bubble burst.
Everybody started trying to sell those comics and went, oh, they're not worth anything whatsoever. And everybody dropped en masse off buying that kind of stuff, which led to a crash.
Those black and white comic boom, fade away kind of quickly. So first 1 year I was ecstatic because everything sold so well, you know. So we said, okay, let's do that. But then in second year, we faced reality. It was not that easy.
Sales plummeted. Viz realized that there were in fact very few people who had actually been interested in the manga they were publishing. And behind the scenes, tensions were rising. Viz and Eclipse couldn't agree on which titles to publish and how to market them, and they came to a showdown over how to launch Urusei Yatsura. Ultimately, the 2 companies parted ways. Viz would move to printing and distributing their books themselves, while Eclipse found a new partner who was more than happy to fill Viz's role in licensing and translating manga titles. Toren Smith. That's right, he's back. Smith was unable to accept defeat, even when he had to sustain himself by shoplifting. He had been hustling and acquiring licenses, and even somehow ended up living on the couch of Studio Gainax, the anime studio that would go on to make Neon Genesis Evangelion. Evangelion? Oh, you guys are gonna be mad at me.
よし、決まりだ。俺の名前知ってたっけ？スミス、トーレン。
Smith had formed his own new company called Studio Proteus and began translating and westernizing the manga he had licensed. But instead of publishing these comics himself, he was shopping them to various US publishers, offering them a turnkey way to get into the manga business.
The Studio Proteus was very central to, popularizing manga.
For Eclipse, Studio Proteus produced Masamune Shiro's Appleseed, Black Magic, and the Smith scripted Dirty Pair, while Dark Horse picked up their localization of Outlanders. Smith was meticulous in his translation work. He was a hardcore fan of this material and knew what needed to be done to get it to sell in the US comic market. Not only did he hire professional translators like Fred Schott, guys everywhere, he rewrote each script himself to read more like American dialogue. He reworked and reworded jokes. They flipped the pages by cutting and pasting rather than just mirroring the images. They retouched the art and had the lettering and sound effects redone in English by one of the American comic industry's leading letterers. Now, while a lot of those ideas, flipping, reworking art, rewriting dialogue, are the kind of things that make manga fans' skin crawl, you have to remember this was a different era. Smith was adamant that for manga to sell in America, it had to feel as much like an American product as possible. For this reason, or perhaps just because of his own taste, Smith mostly worked on heavy science fiction works targeting an older male audience, stuff that appealed to the demographic that was already shopping in comic stores.
It started off very much as the same essential customers that were buying Western comics at that point.
Now, keep that in mind. That's going to be important for later. But for now, Smith's plan worked. Suddenly, there are multiple big publishers alongside Viz putting out manga for the American market. And still, there's one major player we haven't talked about. The biggest manga in Japan in the late 80s was unarguably Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. As I talked about in my Mobius video, Otomo had revolutionized manga by incorporating influence of Western comics, mainly Francis Mobius. So it was, up until this time, probably the most Western-friendly manga ever produced, and it was being turned into an animated movie, and it just plain rules. Every US publisher in the manga business wanted to get their hands on it, but Otomo had already turned down both Studio Proteus and Viz. So who did he go with? Marvel Comics. Specifically because of Archie Goodwin. Goodwin had been Marvel's editor-in-chief in the late 70s, and by the 80s he was editing Marvel's Epic line, where he was doing some really awesome work. One of his big projects was translating the works of Mobius into English, and so when Otomo found out that Archie Goodwin was not only a Mobius fan, but was even friends with the guy, he knew this was the place for him. Marvel and Otomo spared no expense in adapting Akira for the Western market. Not only did they flip it, redo some pages of art, and translate every sound effect, they also had Steve Oliff colorize everything, and it was one of the first comics to ever be digitally colored. It's absolutely beautiful, and if somebody released it today in color, I would probably buy it again for a third time.
And then when Marvel did Akira in color, that really turned a lot of people's heads as well.
It's wild to me that there was a time when Marvel was publishing both Akira and Mobius. How things change. So now, all the players are in the game. Viz, Dark Horse, Eclipse, First Comics, a bunch of clients of Studio Proteus, and now even Marvel. Manga is finally ready to become big in America. That is, until the crash.
Surprisingly, not surprisingly, a couple of years later, there was a second wave and a second crash that was largely spun out of Valiant Comics and the original Image Comics lineup, where again, people were just irrationally exuberant, going, "We can make money if we could buy all this stuff," and then eventually it turned and that crashed as well.
Almost immediately, speculators woke up one morning and realized they wouldn't be paying their mortgage with a long box of copies of Youngblood #1. The whole industry imploded. Some people say that as many as 2/3 of comic shops went out of business. Now remember, comics in America by this point were not being sold anywhere besides specialty comic shops, so suddenly publishers had lost access to most of their customers. First Comics folded and never finished their run of Lone Wolf and Co. Eclipse Comics folded next. Marvel would delay publishing the final issue of Akira for years and got out of the manga business and publishing interesting comics entirely. Pretty much everyone Studio Proteus worked with besides Dark Horse was gone. Studio Proteus might have shut down too, but Smith had quietly built up a profitable business of translating erotic comics for Fantagraphics' Eros line, so they could stay around. In fact, erotic manga was apparently making Smith quite wealthy, and on one of those trips back to Japan, he found the convenience store he used to steal from and repaid them many times over. Thanks to their corporate backing, Viz managed to survive the crash, but they were still struggling. After almost a decade of trying to make manga successful in America, Horibuchi was ready to give up. Viz had tried and tried, but the American comic market was just too unpredictable, and Americans just didn't have enough interest in manga. So he returned to Japan to pitch the executives at Shogakukan the idea of importing coffee table books instead of manga. Now, legend has it that when Horibuchi pitched this idea to his boss, he threw an ashtray at his head.
I mean, he hated me. really, I mean, why you gave up in just in few years? Yeah, he threw me astray, really, literally. I go like that, and he teared my presentation, pamphlet like that.
So it wasn't time to give up just yet. But Horibuchi knew that the American floppy comic just wasn't the ideal delivery method for manga. He wanted to reach mainstream audiences, like manga did in Japan, but the shrinking comic shop market just couldn't provide that. So Viz tried publishing their manga as graphic novels, but these were still expensive niche products that only sold a handful of copies. The market just simply wasn't ready for them.
Because there was so much of the collector mentality wrapped up in comics, and paperbacks are not especially collectible because they're reprints, right? So there was definitely a push from the market of like, well, we're not sure that this is what we want.
Viz was headed for failure. Manga in America was again about to fade away. But one property was about to change everything. Do you take a drink every time I say something's about to change everything? Back in Japan, Viz's parent company, Shogakukan, had gotten the rights to publish ancillary books and material for a new video game property no one had heard of.
It was basically an IP that the licensors were shopping around that nobody wanted. Nobody understood the concept. It was just turned down everywhere. So I think Viz took on the home video and publishing rights as a favor.
And the name of that property? Pokemon.
We were successful to get the rights of publishing all Pokemon books, all Pokemon comics, Pokemon picture books, and so on. That was a huge thing. And also I somehow got rights to publish the video. That's a VHS.
But once Pokemon reached the US, it started a frenzy. While other folks raked in cash on video games, trading cards, and broadcast TV, Viz's seemingly inconsequential right to sell the collected episodes on VHS was game-changing.
We start releasing VHS video, 3 episodes every month. And every month we sold like over 1 million copies,
Viz was making a lot of money from the Pokemon videos.
Seiji was just blown away. He had not envisioned how Pokemon was just going to take off, and of course, Viz just suddenly had tons of money.
But at that time, I was ecstatic because it is like treasure. It's like printing dollars.
From the brink of defeat, Viz was now flush with cash, and they wasted no time staffing up and getting ready to grow both their manga and anime businesses.
I was basically part of the Pokemon hiring spree, and I was brought in without a formal interview nor even a resume. Pretty much everyone there was a fan. Nobody. I don't think anybody was there because that was their career ambition.
The new Viz would be more adventurous, expanding into magazines as well, including my favorite Pulp magazine, which brought Taiyo Matsumoto and many other boundary-pushing manga artists to the West for the first time. But while the VHS business was making them a lot of money, and they were continuing to invest that money in manga wasn't exactly a winner for them, as one young entrepreneur was about to find out.
I'd gone up to Viz in the Bay Area. There was a guy, Horibuchi-san. When I went up there, I said kind of yoroshiku onegaishimasu, which is like the what they call goaisatsu, which is a greeting. And you do this in a way to be polite, to say, hey, I'm going to be in the business. I'm a young guy coming in, I just wanted to say hello. It's like kind of paying respect sort of thing, right? And he looked at me, because he's older than me, kind of senpai type guy, and he just said like, are you stupid? You should never do manga. You're going to be wasting your life.
Yeah, that's Stu Levy, and I think it's time we talk about him, since he's about to become one of the most controversial figures in American manga publishing.
Yeah, I'm the bad guy because I either brought stuff and made it impure, or I didn't bring enough, or I did whatever I did, I did it wrong.
Let's go back nearly 2 decades earlier, when a teenage Stu Levy is backstage at the Grammys. See, Levy grew up in Los Angeles, in the heart of the entertainment world. But while his friends had parents who could score their kids and their friends tickets to the Grammys, Levy's parents were both school teachers, and he came from much humbler means. So, from a young age, Levy committed himself to, no matter what, someday making it in the movie industry, to become a part of the glamorous entertainment world that surrounded him. After college, he went to law school, not to become a lawyer, but to give himself an edge as he sought to become a producer or entrepreneur in the film industry. But during law school, Levy had the opportunity to do a summer study program abroad. Because his best friends growing up were Korean, he decided to do that program in Japan because it was the closest option to Korea. But of course, that summer in Japan would change his life.
I was with a host family every evening for dinner. There was a junior high school kid, and we would watch Dragon Ball on TV every night while we're eating dinner.
Levy thought this could be it, his way into the film industry. He mentioned this to a friend, and things went even further.
And so I thought, wow, this Dragon Ball thing is amazing. I wonder what else is out there. And so this guy said, hey, Stu, read this comic book, this manga. And I read it, and it blew my mind. And that was Parasite. This medium, wow, this is like a movie on page. And I thought, I wonder if it's just this one, or if there are other manga that are just as interesting. I went in the convenience store in Japan, and there was some manga on the shelf, even back then. And I was a big basketball fan growing up, and there was Slam Dunk. Blew through it, it was amazing. About the second, the third, the fourth, and then, in the end, I read the whole series. So I was then aware that manga as a medium was not just a one-off. It wasn't just this one Parasite. It really was the way that they're telling their stories.
Levy stayed in Japan and taught himself Japanese, all with a new goal in mind: get into the Japanese entertainment industry. Like Toren Smith a decade earlier, Levy was so committed to his goal that even extreme poverty wasn't going to stop him. In exchange for his translation services, a Japanese company gave Levy a desk in their office. What they probably didn't know is that Levy was homeless and would wait until everyone left so he could come back to his office and sleep under his desk.
When I realized manga is such an exciting opportunity and a way that perhaps I can eventually move into movie production, film production, which was my dream, I contacted a company that had the rights to Dragon Ball, which was an agent for Toei at the time. And I called them and I said, I would like to get the rights to Dragon Ball I wanted to distribute it and to make a live action movie. And they're like, no.
So he made a pitch deck and found investors who were willing to take a chance on his company. While he sold more control of the company than he would have liked, he now had $500,000 to start building his business. Though this will come back. Each of these companies is structured differently. Viz is an offshoot of a large Japanese publisher. Studio Proteus is an independent concern, owned, as far as I can tell, entirely by Toren Smith. And Levy's new company had serious investors behind it who expected a lot of growth. Add that to your list of things to keep in mind for later. Now, through all of this, Levy had one surprising advantage. He didn't grow up reading comic books. His entire experience with the comic book medium was from his time in Japan, where, again, manga magazines are sold at newsstands and convenience stores, and collected editions are sold at bookshops.
When I first started, I didn't even realize that there was any Japanese manga in the US at all. It was that niche. It was that the distribution was so limited. But I was aware there were a couple comic book shops, but I thought that's not going to be the way that I get people to read this stuff and ultimately make movies, by selling to a couple shops that, barely anybody go to.
So, disinterested in comic shops, Levy and a small team decided they would launch their new company with a magazine. To get licenses for his magazine, he developed a relationship with Kodansha, one of Japan's biggest publishers and a key competitor to Shogakukan, Viz's parent company.
The Japanese companies didn't believe there was going to be a market outside of Japan for any of their stuff, and so nobody paid attention. The people who were in international and worked with a company like ours and said, let these guys try. These young guys just try and give it a shot. Who knows? The editors, oh yeah, fine. Somebody in America wants to do some tiny little magazine, go for it. They didn't pay attention.
From Kodansha, he got the license for Parasite, of course, but his team convinced him there's another title he needed to get.
The one or two young people I was working with in the US, they said, Stu, you got to get Sailor Moon. You got to get Sailor Moon.
Now, what we know today, Sailor Moon was a huge deal. Getting this license was actually a lot easier than expected.
Dark Horse, who was partners with Kodansha for like Megami-sama and a couple other of their very, very early titles, they didn't want Sailor Moon. They said no. Every time Mike said, girls will never read comics, girls don't read comics.
So Levy and his team decided to take the chance on Sailor Moon. They combined Parasite and Sailor Moon, along with two other titles, into a magazine that mixed comics for boys with comics for girls, and so the new company Mix was formed and launched their magazine, Mixing. While dedicated Sailor Moon fans picked up the magazine, It turns out that launching a magazine wasn't such a good business decision. Manga wasn't popular enough to sustain the sales, distributors didn't really want to carry it, and advertisers, who American magazine publishers depend on, weren't interested in a magazine with no articles in it. To try and attract advertisers, Mix began including articles about Japanese pop culture alongside the manga, and thus rebranded the magazine from Mixine to Tokyopop.
I pivoted multiple times, which the fans didn't like, and I understand that looking back.
And while the name Tokyopop stuck, the magazine still wasn't working. They raised more money, giving up more control of the company so they could stay afloat, but they would need a new plan if they were going to stick around any longer. Beyond magazines, Levy had naturally assumed that bookstores would be the other main outlet for manga in the US. He managed to get an introduction to a powerful book distributor, but he was in for a rude awakening.
And I had gone and I talked to him and I showed him our first couple books, Parasite, Magic Knight Ray, Sailor Moon. You know, we're working on these books early stage. And I said, yeah, we really want to distribute these in the bookstore. He laughed and he said, yeah, why would anybody want to read some book from Japan? You know, there's not enough Japanese people, to populate, he just assumed it would only be Japanese people that would read this. I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is for American people. He was just looking at me like I was crazy.
Thankfully, Tokyopop was about to get a life-saving break. The Sailor Moon anime had been bouncing around channels and time slots and had earned a dedicated audience, but now it was going to move to Cartoon Network as part of their new experimental afternoon programming block called Toonami.
Let the fun begin! I can feel the power surging through me.
We took that info, we took all the info from DSC, we made a little press packet, and our distribution guy took it to the retailers and said, okay, they're putting out this book, and it's going to be this cartoon that's on TV.
Unfortunately, despite the fancy press packet, most of the bookstores were simply not interested in carrying the Sailor Moon graphic novels, except one.
The first big bite that we got that really gave us a breakthrough was Walden Books. And there was a young buyer there who said, yeah, I'll take a chance on this thing, why not?
Once Walden Books started bringing in manga, that really changed the landscape.
So who is this young assistant buyer for a mall bookstore who is about to change manga in the US forever? His name is Kurt Hassler.
Kurt Hassler, I think, had a huge influence on the industry.
So before we go any further, let's take a minute to meet Kurt Hassler.
I was the whippersnapper kid who took over the category and started pushing manga.
In 1998, in what seems like a weird twist of fate, Walden Books hired one of America's few otaku as an assistant buyer, and that changed everything. Hassler had grown up reading American comics, begging his mom to drive him to the comic shop an hour away so he could get his fix of Star Wars and X-Men comics. But soon, he had the experience that would change everything.
I mean, my first big introduction was I had moved to Manhattan around 1990, and they were showing Akira. I went and saw that, and then I just could not get my fill of anything coming from Japan, whether it was anime or manga or, the very little you could find at the time that was available, which was next to nothing.
So Hassler became one of the handful of fans buying Viz and Dark Horse manga comics in the wake of the crash. And of course, as a lover of both books and comics, Hassler's main career ambition was to work in a bookstore.
When I moved to New York, I snagged a job at Doubleday Bookshops on Fifth Avenue. Absolutely delighted just to be touching books. The fact that my job was ringing up books and talking about books was very much where I wanted to be.
Years later, Hassler moved from Doubleday to Walden Books, a nationwide chain of mall bookstores, where he worked in data entry. Soon, he hustled his way up to assistant buyer, where he was in charge of buying Eastern regional books for the chain. But he had a greater ambition.
My boss at the time, Stuart Carter, was also a big comics fan. They were changing the category. He took it over, and he knew what a fan I was, so he sort of let me manage that under his wing. And it was not a hot category, and there were actually conversations about, okay, it's time to roll this up and close this category. Stu and I had to beg and say, just give us 6 months, and we think there's real potential here. We got, I think, a shelf. And what are you going to put on that shelf? So it was crucial that we made it sell, or we would lose that space.
So, with a single shelf and 6 months to live, Hassler and his boss had to find a way to save the graphic novel category in Walden Books across the country. This was no easy feat, as Marvel and DC were publishing very few graphic novels at this point, besides the usual perennials like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, along with occasional issue compilations. So, to find a solution, Hassler dove into the data.
And I would regularly see these customer orders for something like Sailor Moon. They just kept popping up and popping up. And so it's like, okay, there's clearly a demand for this. I knew the title. I knew there was a fan base for it.
Remember how I mentioned earlier that Viz and Studio Proteus were focusing on titles that catered to the male demographic who was already shopping at comic shops? Well, Hassler had identified a consumer that was being totally underserved.
There was obviously a large readership of both women and children who, in your typical direct market, superhero focused fan cave, didn't feel welcome.
Girls who were fans of this could not find them on the shelves really practically anywhere. I mean, yeah, there were certain comic shops that may have had a copy or two, but that wasn't really necessarily a destination for teenage girls, especially at the time. The mall was, and I was a mall bookstore.
So Hassler bet big on Sailor Moon, and it would be a bet that would pay off in a big way.
So basically, we had this book. It was the very first manga to get into bookstores. We got Walden Books to say yes through this young guy, Kurt, and they tested it with Sailor Moon, and it worked. That one started to move.
We could not meet demand. We were the place that suddenly these were available on the shelves, and we were getting flooded with girls running in to find it.
The wonderful thing about Sailor Moon was that it really brought a lot of young women and girls into the market.
It was Sailor Moon flying off the shelves. We couldn't keep it in, and that kind of drove, all right, we need to go deeper here. This is clearly where the customer wants us to be.
Both Hassler and Tokyopop had a huge hit on their hands. Hassler got promoted and was soon in charge of the graphic novel category, not just for Walden Books, but also for their parent company, Borders. Of course, trying to bring manga to bookstores across the country wasn't without its challenges.
You know, some of the stores really embraced that and found ways to make space for it. Other stores would get the product and just send it right back to the warehouse. They're like, we have no space for this, we don't want it.
And while Tokyopop might be making enough money to stay afloat, they still had challenges of their own.
Sailor Moon was working, but the other titles like, Ice Blade, Parasite, they were struggling.
So Tokyopop, emboldened by the success of Sailor Moon and desperate to find their place in the industry, were about to make their most daring move yet.
I had already seen in Korea that the Korean manhwa, the early Korean mangas, were made left to right because Koreans write that way. But the Japanese ones, they published right to left, and they kept in the original form. But then when I went to Germany, I saw that Dragon Ball, they were publishing it right to left. At the same time, the Shueisha guy, we were having early talks with him about trying our first couple titles. And he had said, we would only license these to you if you do not flip them. And I was torn, I wasn't sure. But then I saw this thing in Germany and I thought, maybe we not only don't flip them, but we actually use that as our promotional, like a big promotional hook.
Not flipping not only meant more licenses, it meant that the whole expensive process of flipping, relettering, reworking everything, it was all eliminated.
We're keeping the artwork, which is amazing, and we're saving costs. It's like, win-win. As an entrepreneur, that's a dream. You're increasing the quality and you're lowering your costs. Like, who doesn't want that, right?
And they had the support of a very important ally.
I was in a position to say, okay, if you can get the licenses, just don't flip them.
But this wasn't going to just be a few books printed right to left as an experiment. They were making plans to take it further. Inspired by the way Sony and PlayStation had revolutionized the video game market with their consistent packaging and pricing, Tokyopop added another element to their plan.
Fast forward to us sitting in this conference room in LA, trying to figure out what do we do to launch this right to left thing. We came up with this plan that said, let's standardize it. Let's make it one size, one look, one price, one branding. We found the size that was right in the middle of all the sizes. We said, let's get this size right in the middle.
As far as the trim size goes, it's not exactly, the same trim size you see in Japan. The dimensions are off, but it's closer to it while still being something that is It was recognizable on the shelves.
Not only were they standardizing the size, they were standardizing the price. Manga graphic novels up until this point were premium products, typically between $15 or $20, which would be over $30 today. Part of that was the expense of flipping the artwork, but part of it was just that they were selling so few, with print runs of maybe 2,000 copies.
I was guaranteeing from the beginning I'd be, more than double that with the initial orders. So once you start operating at that scale, then it's like, okay, let's be aggressive on the price point.
With guaranteed sales, Tokyopop was able to take a risk with a radically lower price point of $9.99.
These are kids. If we can get it under $10, is that an easier purchase for them?
But they still had one more element to add to the mix.
And this guy who was the head of sales had come from electronics. So he was selling things to like Best Buy and all these kinds of, mass stores. And they used these kinds of displays in the store, floor displays, which really were never used in bookstores at all. And he said, why don't we do a floor display? One of our bookstore guys, no, they can't do that. You can't do that in bookstores.
I feel strongly enough about it that if you can get enough licenses, I'll give you a floor display. And I'll get you like a 6 to 8 pocket floor display and feature every one of those titles. And we'll just call it, authentic whatever.
Again, I don't remember who exactly it was, but this 100% authentic manga read the right to left way.
And so here it was, 100% authentic manga was born. A timed release of 9 titles printed right to left with Japanese sound effects intact, each only $9.99, with a big floor display and marketing campaign to go along with it. Tokyopop was betting everything on this launch. It was their last chance to save the company.
Once the trade learned of our plans to publish these books all reading right to left, it proclaimed us to be insane and that the company would die and go out of business.
I mean, well, if they can make it work, more power to them, but it won't work.
And I remember one article that said, this is the stupidest idea ever.
Then when it went into the stores, the pushback from the stores is, oh, this is misprinted. All of this is misprinted.
And literally, if it had not worked, the company would have been gone at the time. We would have been completely gone, and it worked. Not only did it work, it was like a home run.
I mean, Kurt Hassler, his bet paid off. It did pay off.
100% authentic manga was an absolute home run. It turned out that there were lots of fans who wanted unflipped, more literally translated manga, and Tokyopop's gamble on standardization paid off, because all of a sudden readers were taking chances on manga they'd never heard of because it was racked and looked similar to the books they were already buying. Tokyopop's entire line started to grow, and the Tokyopop name became synonymous with this unflipped, digest-sized manga. But there was another company who had spent almost 2 decades trying to bring manga to the US, and they were not going to sit idly by.
Viz was kind of a sleeping giant, and we had awakened them.
Almost since the inception of manga in the US, Viz had been the market leader. But now, in what seemed like almost overnight, everything had changed. Things had gone from floppy comics to graphic novels, from comic shops to bookstores, and Viz had found themselves struggling to keep up.
I had a sense that Seiji and Satoru and some of the other higher-ups, the VP level people, had been discussing what Tokyopop was doing with the format. And the question was whether or not we should adapt to that or not. And I was in the meeting where it was decided that we would just wholesale pretty much adapt to that format. So I can clearly say, yeah, Tokyopop definitely pioneered that format and really opened the doors into the shopping malls. But I do credit Viz with being it was pretty decisive to go ahead and follow that format.
Not only were Viz going to borrow Tokyopop's trim size, they're going to undercut them on price.
Dragon Ball was suddenly the Tokyopop trim size, but rather than $9.95, it was $7.95.
One way of looking at Tokyopop is just what was great was like you could see what they were doing, and if something started working, you could say, well, maybe we could do that too. So it was kind of shameless, but it was kind of great that in a way the two rival companies we work pretty dynamically in order to grow the market, and in some ways both companies play to their strengths.
Copying Tokyopop and undercutting them on price might be enough to help them catch up, but it wasn't going to give them market dominance back. They were growing, but still trailing behind, so they began working on their most ambitious plan yet. The Oga family, who owned Shogakukan, Viz's parent company, also owned the manga publisher Shueisha, but despite being owned by the same family, the two companies were fierce rivals. But in terms of manga, Shueisha was unmatched. Shueisha's flagship title was a little manga magazine called Shonen Jump. You may have heard of Shonen Jump, but I cannot overstate the dominance and importance of Shonen Jump at this time in Japan.
The Shonen Jump is the treasure of the Japanese manga magazine.
In a single weekly installment in the early 2000s, you could read One Piece, Naruto, Hunter x Hunter, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Bleach, and many others. Its circulation had peaked a few years earlier at somewhere between 7 and 9 million copies every single week. That's more than nearly any American publication, comic or otherwise, in a country with a third of the population. Shueisha wielded this power aggressively. Stu Levy actually mentioned them earlier. They were the ones who refused to license their manga to anyone who would flip it. Now, Viz had already managed, with some difficulty, to get the rights to Shueisha's Dragon Ball, but the rest of Shueisha's vast library was out of anyone's reach. Well, not anyone. Years earlier, before anyone suspected the size of the American market, Shueisha had come to someone else.
They came to me and they said, hey, would you want to do this Shonen Jump magazine English version? And I had just gotten killed doing magazines for like 3 or 4 or whatever years. And I said, I would love to do the titles. I can't do it as a magazine. And they said, no, we're looking for a partner who will do the magazine. And then if you do the magazine, you do the graphic novels. And I was such an idiot. I said no.
So now Viz wanted to partner with Shueisha, but it wasn't going to be easy. Not only would Viz have to publish an English language version of Shonen Jump magazine, even if they lost money, as part of the deal, Viz would have to sell a major block of ownership of Viz to Shueisha. But Horibuchi agreed. He knew the value of that treasure trove of manga. Even if they lost money on the magazine, they would make it up in the graphic novels, and it could be what they needed to turn the tide in their fight with Tokyopop.
That was a big business deal for me to make it happen.
I think what really changed was Shonen Jump magazine.
Meanwhile, Shueisha's coming into Viz. That was a massive shift in the landscape.
All at once, Viz had the licenses to some of Japan's most successful manga, and would rapidly begin producing volumes in the Tokyopop trim size at $7.95. And Horibuchi didn't just get the manga licenses this time, he also got the TV rights.
Where Viz really started to create some separation was Cartoon Network.
By working closely with Cartoon Network, Viz managed to get Shonen Jump properties on US TV. Just as Cartoon Network had aired Sailor Moon and driven Tokyopop's manga business, now Naruto and other anime series would be a marketing campaign for Viz's new line of manga. It was an incredible coup, and allowed Viz to not only close the gap, but overtake Tokyopop. But for Horibuchi himself, it would be his final act as CEO.
And around 2004, I probably lost interest. I mean, I've been in charge of the company for over 20 some years. I created the foundation of those graphic novels, distribution and all that. But after I really left the, Viz Comics itself, then everything started going so well.
Horibuchi would continue his career connecting Japanese and American cultures, building the New People facility in San Francisco, as well as bringing American companies like Blue Bottle Coffee and Dandelion Chocolate to Japan. With Horibuchi gone, Viz hired a new CEO, and began looking internally for new management to help fuel this explosive growth.
I was kind of a slacker coming into this job, right? Like I wasn't intending to become a high-tech billionaire or work in a bank or anything. But I think kind of more as just a sense of solidarity with my coworkers. I just wanted to help organize things. That was sort of my second career at Viz, was I became sort of the managing editor logistics guy.
The fierce competition between Viz, Tokyopop, Dark Horse, and other new publishers who were popping up meant lots of new titles for readers. Viz even finally published Fred Schott's translation of Phoenix that he had done 25 years earlier. And Borders' biggest competitor, Barnes & Noble, began expanding their manga business as well. Suddenly, bookstores had opened up a second front for the comic business in America.
American comics publishers, who I love, started to be kind of not thrilled that there was a lot more manga on the shelves than there was Batman or Spider-Man.
Marflin DC had missed the bookstore boat, and while they made some attempts to produce books for this new youth-oriented market, they ultimately chose to prioritize the collectors and adult readers in comic shops, effectively handing the next generation of comic fans over to manga, the ramifications of which we still feel today.
From what Kurt did at Borders, really bifurcated the markets into two very separate, very distinct things.
Now, I've made a whole other video about how Scholastic used the opening created by manga to enter the bookstore market, but at this point in the mid-aughts, nothing could come close to manga's sales.
Manga was just selling kind of like hotcakes, and a couple of years of real high growth and great times before the troubles set in.
The first person to ring the alarm bell was, of all people, Toren Smith. In 2004, just as manga was beginning its ascent to the peak, Smith foretold doom. First, he decried the decline in quality of this new wave of manga. He was disappointed to see that this manga boom, in its haste, was leaving sound effects intact, making translations more literal, and often using low-quality scans of artwork. But privately, Smith admitted that he was a dinosaur.
Toren's packaging was over-engineered because it was expensive.
Smith had devoted his life to getting Americans to read manga, but now the very things that had made Studio Proteus so special were the things the market no longer wanted. Smith's gravest concern, however, was the oversupply of manga. That these companies, in their haste and exuberance, were flooding the market with product at an unsustainable rate. And Smith was more than just talk. In his anger and frustration, he sold Studio Proteus's library of titles to Dark Horse and quit the manga industry entirely.
You know, Toren realized what was happening, I think. He was very smart, and he got out at the right time.
Apparently, his Eros work and some savvy investments had made Smith quite wealthy, and he was able to spend the rest of his life pursuing other hobbies like scuba diving before he passed away in 2012 without ever returning to the manga business. But if anyone had heard Smith's warnings in 2004, they certainly weren't listening to him.
During those packaged media days, if you couldn't sell more and more of one title, you had to release more titles to grow your revenue. Those are the only two ways you could grow your income. So the only way we could grow the business was to put out more titles. So we went from 3 a month to 5 a month to 10 a month to eventually at our peak, we got up to 40 a month.
I think there was probably 1 year in there where we probably must have increased the number of books we were putting out like 8-fold or something.
And the problem was there was an arms race. That was the situation as well. It wasn't just us.
There was that kind of arms race where there was that moment where you're trying to see how many books a year you were going to be putting out.
New competitors came onto the market. ADV, who was a big anime company, started a manga line. Central Park Media, which was an anime company, started a manga line.
It's very easy early days because literally anything we could get, the fans would buy. Everything sold because there was not enough. But as more started coming in, that fandom gets dispersed among all the different titles.
There was a point where I just thought, this is a bubble waiting to burst.
The ones who make it over the long term are judicious about what they publish, how they publish, when they publish, why they publish. But Tokyopop thought that there was a limitless demand that would never stop, that if they just kept shoving into the marketplace, that the market would go, cool, we'll take it, we want it.
Oversupply was a problem, but it was not an avoidable problem. I look at it, and there were really only 2 options then. One option was you go through that arms race and you put out the product and you compete and you continue to kind of keep your market share, even if it becomes oversaturation for the market, or you don't. And so that's why it got harder to license titles, is that titles became competitive and were put out to bid. There was just way too much product for the market to handle.
But oversupply was only the first of many challenges the US manga industry was about to face. Now, as is probably apparent, much of the manga industry in America was dependent on Kurt Hassler.
I started doing more than would typically be sort of the buyer's role.
Kurt had a pretty clear idea of what would work in his stores and what we as publishers should be doing.
I started having direct conversations with the publishers who, I would say, look, we can take more.
being on conference calls with Kurt and the sales team, and Kurt just yelling at us, basically berating us on everything from what titles we were selecting to, I don't know, shipping logistics.
In 2006, industry insiders voted Hassler as the most powerful person in American manga, but Hassler was about to surprise everyone.
There had been a lot of management changes at Borders and Walden. Not all of them kind of came from a book background. Again, I'm not saying they're bad people, but if I had heard one more analogy of books to ketchup, I just couldn't.
And so, at the height of his influence, Hassler quit his job at Borders. Borders, the single largest customer for both Viz and Tokyopop, were in the process of collapse, and manga's biggest advocate inside the bookstore world had just left. And still, the worst was yet to come. As manga fandom grew, the internet kept pace.
Piracy started to play a big role.
But 2006 is also when you had the scanlation aggregators really come up in a major way.
I think that scanlations were succeeding because they were way ahead of what the publishers were doing.
Even many of the most popular series in Japan were dozens if not hundreds of chapters ahead of the legal US releases, even as the publishers raced to catch up.
The demand was still there. It just shifted to a channel that was away from this market. It was, every book is free. I'm the internet generation. Why would I pay for a book?
The title that really drove that home to us was Gaku and Alice. There was a lot of excitement behind it, and we thought this would be it. We would have a major hit. So we actually paid quite a lot of money to get the title. And I remember the first orders came in, and they were terrible. And we thought, what has happened here? And one of our team members showed us online, somebody said, look, and I think it was Manga Fox, and they had the number of downloads of each title. The number one title that week was Gaku and Alice, and it had over 1 million downloads.
And things would still get even worse. The US economy collapsed in what became known as the Great Recession. While this hurt all businesses, it had an extra impact on the manga industry.
The side where that came much more suddenly and somewhat unexpectedly was the shopping malls went out of business. And so we're talking about Suncoast Video, Blockbuster, and that's hit the home video side of the business very hard and very fast.
So when mall video stores closed, when Blockbuster went away, the anime market dried up, and that was a huge blow to the manga market. And of course, with malls going away, that meant no more mall bookstores, which had been one of the biggest discovery points for American teens to get into manga. And while all the companies were suffering, there was one company that was going to feel this pain more than all of the others. Let's rewind just a few years, to 2006 or so, to the height of Tokyopop's success, and try to understand what happened.
To be honest, there was a little bit of hubris going on with Tokyopop.
We had the number one market share, and so we were really confident. We felt like we knew what we were doing, and people had to copy us because that's what they were doing as well. And so it did give us a certain amount of arrogance, I would say.
Others might disagree with me, but there was a certain point where I think there was a perception that Tokyopop was the draw more than the titles. That's not sustainable. It's not the brand that goes on the book, it's the book.
That's probably the downside, is when you're the leader and when you're really building something and growing, it can move into hubris. And we had some of that, definitely.
In a sense, they were the innovators. They did a lot of stuff that worked really well, and they did some stuff that didn't really work, but they were always trying out new stuff.
I was confident in some ways, but I lacked experience. And so it was hard to make decisions about the areas that the VCs were experts at. They supposedly knew what they were doing, and we were following them. They really pushed us to grow. So we released more titles and more titles. I opened up our European office, and we built up a Germany company, and that was costing us millions of dollars at the time to build that up. And we got into original manga and developing our own. That also cost us millions of dollars at the time.
There was that moment where they branded themselves as Tokyopop.com and tried to create an entire social media platform.
We even produced movies, and because I love movies so much, I directed a few.
They even produced a reality show on Hulu, which Levy himself hosted.
Because we were VC backed, there was an expectation that we would grow the business and eventually have an exit. The investors wanted an IPO. in 2004, when the company really was at its peak, I was approached by Paul Levitz, who was running DC Comics at the time. And Paul was very interested in acquiring Tokyopop. We did get an offer. It was really interesting, but the Japanese investor, the VC, wanted more. That was a time when we should have made a deal. That looking back, it was probably one of my biggest, that and Shonen Jump were my two biggest mistakes in business, I'd say. We had missed the opportunity to sell the company at the peak, and so we were just kind of stuck, and then things got really tough.
As Tokyopop grew in every direction, as they raced to produce more manga than everyone else, as they were wrapped up trying to sell the company, the core product was suffering.
Me and my team we were definitely holding the line on the number of releases, but Tokyopop was released. I think at one point they were probably releasing twice the amount of books that we were.
Talking to Tokyopop at the time about, okay, you have to change the way you're printing these books because they're falling apart. People read them once and they have a sheaf of papers lying on the floor. So it was talking about, you got to change the binding. You need to find a better printer.
And Tokyopop's original English manga had turned into a disaster. Their contracts were seen as one-sided and unfair to creators, and it hurt their reputation. Soon, Levy himself became something like public enemy number one for the comic press, with numerous pieces criticizing him and his management style.
People who wrote articles about me had never really met me or knew me. They just didn't put in that time. So they only looked at actions or certain little quips and put together a picture of who they believed I was without ever really getting to know me.
But the pounding Tokyopop was taking was only about to get worse. As part of the sale process, Kodansha and Random House had explored buying Tokyopop outright. They had ultimately decided not to, but soon, Levy and Tokyopop were in for a surprise.
We were publishing, our biggest hits at the time were Chobits and Love Hina. And both titles were ending kind of around the same time. There was a unspoken yet sometimes spoken rule that if you published an author, you as a licensee would have first dibs at that next work. So we just assumed when both of those titles finished that the next works that were going to come out were going to come into Tokyopop. And then we read Random House through Del Rey, their line, is starting a manga division. Both of those titles were announced by Del Rey, and I was shocked. My whole company was shocked. Everybody was just couldn't believe that Kodansha would do that to us.
And just as they were overspending on new ventures, just as they were losing valuable licenses, the oversupply issue was about to catch up with them. Now, it's important here to note the difference between comic shops and bookstores. When a comic shop buys something from a publisher, they own it. But in the bookstore world, if a bookstore decides they no longer want a product, they can send it back to the publisher for a full refund.
Typically, a book publisher has 20 to 25% product returns. In the beginning, when manga was very small, it was like 10 to 15%. And then as the glut began and there was too much product, it went to 25%, 30%, 35%. A lot of books came back.
Now, imagine what happens when you spent the past few years trying to own the market by flooding it with as much material as possible, and it begins to contract.
The very, very first sign that we're in trouble was Barnes & Noble, Borders, returning like 80% of the product they had ordered.
Tokyopop was being shipped back thousands and thousands of units that they not only had to pay for, but also had to pay shipping on.
It happened very fast and it accelerated to the point where our capital went away. I think our biggest mistake, my biggest mistake as the CEO, was not raising capital when I had the chance.
No investor wants to invest in a failing business, and no acquirer wants to buy them. It was too late.
We were already really challenged. We weren't growing anymore. We were having these returns go up, our costs were getting higher. So we were really being beaten up all around. And then Borders went out of business. I mean, the Borders thing, it took the whole industry by surprise, really.
The publishing side was less of a cliff because we had seen things coming because Borders had been having issues for years. So by the time that actually happened, which was the real main final domino, we were kind of ready for it.
And when that happened, they owed us $1 million that they immediately said they're not going to pay. They had a bunch of our books sitting in their warehouse that they weren't going to send back anymore.
With the Borders bankruptcy, the last of Tokyopop's cash was gone.
And we had owed a lot of money to licensors and other people. And so I had to then go and make a decision and say, we're sort of having to throw in the towel. We had dozens of people, and in one day we had to lay off 2/3 of the staff, and people were crying, and it was just, for sure, it was the worst day of my whole life, and the worst day for a lot of people. And I was just trying to figure out what to do, and frustrated. And at some point in early 2011, I realized we can't continue publishing operations at all, and we need to let go of the whole staff. That was it. That was the end of the ride at the time. We're going through all of that, and I flew to Japan in March of 2011, and I had meetings with the publishers, and the day after I arrived, the massive tsunami in Japan hit. The fact is, every single morning I would wake up and I would drive to an hour and a half with trucks and spend the day with the different people. We were shoveling mud and doing all these things, and after being there and seeing parents who lost children and families who lost houses and all the suffering, I realized, companies come and go, and we're fortunate. We can rebuild a company, we can get a job, we can do other things, but these people up in Tohoku, what they lost is unbelievable. And seeing their strength and their resilience, it may sound like a story, but they helped me, the people on the ground helped me more than I helped them in the end, by inspiring me and giving me the courage to keep going and to see things with perspective. Certainly the core of who I am is what it is. I always have felt like a very ethical person with great intentions, but I probably got caught up too much in greed. But for me, it wasn't necessarily that I wanted the money so I could buy stuff. Money was about keeping score and seeing if you can succeed and competing. But that philosophy, that spirit, in the end, it's very shallow. It's not really what you're trying to do in the world. And so that I learned about that. I learned about that from having tough times. So after the whole tsunami finished and I was finished with my charity documentary, I visited Germany a few times because the German business was the only business really left, and I could take a small salary so I could somehow still survive.
In just a few years, Tokyopop had gone from manga pioneer and industry leader to a one-man German outpost. Had Tokyopop sold to DC and Warner, Levy would have been fabulously wealthy, a millionaire many times over. Now, he was considering getting a job as a barista to supplement the meager money Tokyopop was making. In many ways, the early aughts manga boom had been driven by Tokyopop and Borders. In less than a decade, both companies were out of business, but the story of manga in America was still far from over. The years went by. Many people, like Alvin Liu, left the industry entirely. But while some companies were going under, others were just getting started.
There was a lot of movement in the market at the time, and I felt like there was an opportunity out there to do something maybe a little bit different, and that's how Yen came to be.
Hassler realized that while Kodansha, Shogakukan, and Shueisha were well served by the existing companies, there were still many good titles from other publishers in Japan that were being neglected. Of course, not everyone in the industry was supportive of this idea. As one article at the time said, although everyone in the graphic novel business recognizes Hassler's importance, not everyone approved of the way he wielded his power. One industry figure, who wished to remain anonymous, wondered if Hassler would be able to make the transition to publishing, telling ICV2, "We'll see how his skills translate to selling." And the timing was also against Yen Press.
2007, we launched our first books. 2008, the entire global economy crashed, not to mention the manga bubble crash, which sort of compounded that whole thing. It couldn't have been worse. It could not have been a worse time.
Still, Yen persisted, taking a somewhat conservative approach.
Quality of the product always came first.
In the next few years, while the manga market shrunk, while Borders and Tokyopop faded away, Yen quickly rose and became the second largest publisher behind Viz. And soon, others would be drawn back to the business. After Kodansha split their licenses between Tokyopop and Del Rey, both businesses failed and left Kodansha without a dedicated US partner. So they decided to build some of their own businesses in the USA, including a digital business. And they knew just who to hire to run it.
I wasn't sure if I really wanted to get back into manga publishing per se, or do exactly what I was doing before. But I didn't miss working with comics, which is still a medium that I still love. So I took up on it.
Under Liu, this digital business was a success. Soon, they decided to merge his successful digital business with the rest of their US subsidiaries into a single entity, Kodansha USA. Of course, Liu himself was in for a surprise.
I wasn't expecting them to name me as the CEO of that merch entity, but that's what ended up happening.
And Lou wasn't the only one who'd been drawn back to the business.
I thought I can't sit on the sidelines much longer. Why don't I dip my toes back in the water of publishing in the US? With just one or two people I hired, young people. And so I restarted publishing, believe it or not. Then COVID hit. And once that happened, it was like, all right, well, I guess there goes that. There goes publishing. There goes reviving Tokyopop. Time to throw in the towel.
The manga market had been hobbling along for the better part of a decade since the closure of borders, and now every remaining retail outlet will be closed for the foreseeable future.
This was very sudden. I was looking at doomsday scenarios, trying to see how long we could hold out based on cash reserves. I was basically preparing for the worst, not knowing what was going to happen month to month.
But surprisingly, the lockdown didn't spell doom for manga at all.
Because people weren't locked down, they're streaming anime 24/7.
And then the most amazing thing happened near the end of 2020 and moving into 2021, manga started selling.
Once Barnes and Nobles reopened their doors, manga sales went like through the roof.
In 2022, manga sales reached a new high of 20 million books sold.
And if you look at where manga sales were during the pandemic, it blows away what the market high was in 2006. It's not even comparable. It's not even a contest.
You know, last couple of years there have been ups and downs, but Tokyopop is doing all kinds of things. We don't have the 60-70% market share in the US publishing market like we did back in the day, and just trying to navigate it and not make mistakes. I mean, there's always mistakes, but not do those big mistakes like back in the day.
The potential audience is still significantly larger. It's obviously grown a lot, particularly than when I started, and in some sense beyond my imagination. Something about anime and manga it taps into something universal.
Sitting here in 2025, we're living in a world where manga is mainstream, not just in the US, but around the world. From that very first meeting of a handful of members of the Cartoon Fantasy League to today, when an anime movie can top the US box office, anime and manga have reshaped US pop culture. And of course, this is a credit to the tremendous quality of these comics. But the popularity of manga in the US is also due to decades of work by dedicated fans of this medium who wanted to share their love of manga with everyone. Some of them I got to feature in this video, and many of them I didn't. But as an American who loves manga, who grew up during the manga boom, I am incredibly grateful to all of them.
I just hope that more people would get interested in them, but I didn't see manga as becoming anywhere near the phenomenon that they are today. I never dreamed that it would become as big as it has become.
Thank you so much to Fred, Seiji, Kurt, Alvin, Stu, and Brian, all for taking the time to speak with me. This video was the result of more than 11 hours of interviews with them. So if there's any insight here, it's because of their generosity with their time. I usually like to recommend some comics in these videos, but this one's been all about business. So I'll put some links to my favorite manga down in the description below, in case you're just stopping by and are curious what all the fuss is about. And after the Mobius video got demonetized after I spent 7 months on it, I finally caved and decided to start a Patreon. So if you like my work and want to support it, I'll put a link for that down below as well. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you soon.